In the blistering 105-degree Texas heat, the air was thick with the stinging stench of crude oil and sour sweat, and the heavy machinery on Rig 3 roared with a bone-rattling intensity. Without warning, a flawlessly designed, dust-free alien assault pod slammed onto the deck. Its state-of-the-art optical cloaking system instantly became an absolute joke against the flying black sludge. The pristine hull was immediately stained a mottled, filthy black. Marcus gripped his massive 100-pound pipe wrench, completely plastered in viscous drilling mud. He spat out a mouthful of gritty, sand-laced saliva. He couldn't care less if a four-armed, heavily armed alien warlord stepped out of that silver hatch. All he gave a damn about was that this piece of extraterrestrial space junk had just smashed the blowout preventer line they'd spent all morning rigging up. That meant he and his boys were staring down the barrel of a catastrophic well blowout, or worse, a lethal explosion. The alien assault captain raised a plasma rifle capable of vaporizing alloy and demanded these sub-tier laborers surrender control of the sector's resources. Marcus wasn't in the mood to listen to his universal translator. He just turned, shot a crude middle finger up at the control room supervisor, and yanked the high-pressure mud pump valve wide open. "I don't give a rat's ass what shiny rock y'all flew in from," Marcus muttered through clenched teeth. "You cause a blowout on my rig, you pay up with your damn life." The wire-reinforced industrial hose bucked violently under his palms. The pressure gauge's red needle slammed against the 5,000 psi limit pin with a loud metallic clack. Thick black mud hissed and oozed from the welded seams of the pipe. The hatch had barely slid open when two alien vanguards stepped out, clad in gleaming silver thermal armor. A synthesized voice from their helmet speakers rigidly recited the preamble of the Interstellar Subjugation Act. They didn't even get through half a sentence. Marcus' biceps bulged to the point of tearing as he wrestled the heavy hose nozzle toward the blindingly bright crack of the hatch. With a vicious twist of his wrist, he cranked the discharge valve to the max. A thunderous, multi-ton deluge of barite-loaded black mud roared out like an angry dragon. The sheer kinetic impact blasted the two clueless aliens half a meter off the deck, weapons and all. Before their arms could even twitch into a tactical evasion protocol, they were violently slammed against a steel guardrail 10 feet away. The heavy alloy rail dented deep, raining flakes of rust. The two shock troopers folded like crushed tin cans, sliding down the rail into the ankle-deep sludge of oil and mud. Their optical sensors, now caked in impenetrable black muck, didn't catch a single glint of light. They thrashed helplessly in the mud a couple of times before their limbs locked up entirely. A few roughnecks who had just wandered over, gripping heavy wrenches, erupted into a chorus of harsh, guttural laughter. One guy whistled sharply, tossing his hard hat half a meter into the air. Commander Karen's tactical visor synchronized the live feed from outside the pod. On her holographic HUD, two red markers representing her vanguard troops were violently blinking with critical failure warnings. Their optical arrays were totally blinded, and their joint servo motors were deadlocked by an unknown high-viscosity black fluid. They couldn't even lift a finger. She stared out at the pack of sludge-covered carbon-based life forms barking with savage laughter. One of them tossed a helmet into the air, its bright yellow shell catching a blinding glare under the toxic Texas sun. The sheer absurdity of the scene froze the battle-hardened commander, a veteran who had subjugated 17 primitive civilizations, for 3 full seconds. Utter disbelief drilled straight through her neural interface. Not a single tactical simulation had ever predicted an opening like this. No energy shields, no standardized weapon arrays, not even decent cover. Just a mob of natives in torn coveralls, waving iron wrenches and laughing their asses off at her elite shock troopers. Karen gritted her teeth fiercely. Cranking her tactical visor to maximum brightness, she pointed sharply at the hatch and barked a lethal order to the 10 elite troopers lined up behind her. Deploy tactical fan formation. Full suppression fire. Use your plasma rifles to burn these unevolved savages to ash. The kinetic servos of 10 thermal armor suits emitted a low, synchronized hum. The elite soldiers simultaneously raised their plasma rifles, pale blue energy particles pooling in the acceleration chambers. Booting through the slick, oily mud, they rapidly fanned out from the pod, executing a textbook suppression formation in a heartbeat. Karen herself stepped through the hatch, leveling a modified high-yield plasma rifle. Her thermal crosshairs locked dead onto the massive, mud-spattered roughneck up front, the one lugging the 100-pound wrench. Squeezing her finger, she yanked the trigger. Marcus felt a blistering wave of heat scorch past his ear. The oil-slicked hair at his temples instantly curled into blackened crisps. The brilliant blue beam from the modified plasma rifle barely grazed the rim of his hard hat, punching straight up into a super-concentrated methane cloud hovering above the deck. With a muffled boom, a blinding fist-sized fireball detonated mid-air, spewing a rain of scalding gas and debris in every direction. The shockwave slapped Marcus' coveralls flat against his sweat-drenched spine. He roared out a string of Texas curses that echoed across the rig, planted his boots on the ice-slick black sludge, and threw himself to the side. The 100-pound wrench dragged across the steel deck, sparking like a Roman candle. 2 quick rolls and he crashed deep into the heavy steel blind spot behind the massive generator cluster. The half-meter-thick cast-iron casing instantly swallowed the shrapnel and blast wave. He leaned back against the running, piping-hot generator casing, gasping for air. Black muck and sweat poured down his forehead. Peering through a gap in the steel plates, he watched the plasma-ignited fireball ride a wave of combustible gas, rolling at terrifying speed straight into the center of the alien squad's fan formation. Under the orange-red tongues of flame, the temperature readouts on those 10 gleaming thermal suits began to wildly spike. A thermal alarm suddenly shrieked inside Karen's helmet. The piercing, high-frequency squeal instantly shredded every tactical comm channel. Glancing down at her wrist terminal, she saw 3 of the 10 bright blue dots representing her vanguard flash a blinding, bloody red. The temperature readouts were jumping so fast they blurred. The 3-point men had barely lifted their boots to dodge the incoming fireball when the critical heat blew right through their servo motor's protective circuits. With a few sharp cracks, their joints completely seized up. They were nailed upright to the oil-soaked steel plates, unable to even turn their necks, reduced to squeezing out bizarre, dying rasps through their faceplates. The bright silver armor warped under the extreme heat, and even the slick optical camo plating started to blister and bubble. The back of Karen's neck felt like it was pressed against a red-hot drill pipe. The frantic exhaust from her cooling vents blasted across her skin, nearly roasting her flesh. The remaining 7 elites who hadn't been swallowed by the fireball instantly broke formation. One rookie completely lost his mind. He threw up his rifle and squeezed the trigger straight into the incoming blast wave. A bright blue plasma bolt grazed the edge of Karen's helmet, nearly melting right through her visor. Bellowing with rage, Karen slapped the gun away, her knuckles turning white. She had commanded the interstellar assault force through 17 intergalactic campaigns, steamrolled 37 primitive homeworlds, and had never set foot in a hellhole where firing your weapon was the equivalent of strapping a bomb to your own chest. She ground her back teeth, opening her mouth to order an immediate fallback behind the drop pod's airlock for a thermal cycle. Up in the control room, old Phil slammed his heavy knuckles down on the main shutoff switch for the blowout valves. The massive solenoid valves engaged with a deep, heavy thud. Every peripheral gas line locked down instantly. The combustible gas detectors, which had been screaming bloody murder for 10 minutes, finally shut up, dropping their buzz down to a safe, steady hum. Chewing on the end of a dead cigar, Phil didn't even blink. He scanned the dozen monitors in front of him. On the thermal feed, the remaining 7 overheating silver tin cans were bunching together and stumbling back toward their drop pod, their tactical formation completely shot to hell. 3 other guys, their joints fused by the fire, were twitching in the mud, unable to wiggle a single finger. Phil grabbed the PA mic, his gravelly Texas drawl dropping like an anvil out of every speaker on the rig, rattling the sheet metal housings. "All right, boys, grab your gear. Let's treat these glowing tin cans like scrap metal." The roughnecks hiding behind the generators and pipe racks erupted into a chorus of hoots and hollers. Somebody slammed a massive wrench against a steel guardrail, sending sparks half a foot into the air. Marcus slicked his singed hair back, slammed his 100-pound wrench into the mud by his boots, and paired up with 3 beefy riggers. Together they laid their fingers over the triggers of 2 high-pressure industrial hoses plumbed straight into the heavy barite mud pumps. Their eyes locked onto the backs of 4 alien elites trying to flank them from the side. Marcus flexed his knuckles and popped the safety pin with a sharp clack, pinning the heavy metal trigger dead down. Both hoses, fed by the high-pressure mud pumps, unleashed a deafening roar. Driven by 5,000 psi, the insanely dense barite drilling mud blasted out like 4 living black dragons. The roughnecks worked in pairs, dead gripping the hoses as they bucked wildly. Thick canvas straps dug into their backs, muscles bulging, boots dragging jagged black lines through the oily sludge as the recoil slammed them violently forward. The 4 alien elites creeping toward the blind spot had just raised their plasma rifles to shoulder height when they caught a face full of physical trauma that completely obliterated their tactical algorithms. The point man didn't even get the chance to let his armor's warning systems beep. He was blasted an inch off the deck and sent flying backward, slamming hard into a half-meter-thick main oil pipeline. The moment the mud hit his gleaming silver thermal armor, it began sizzling, billowing corrosive white smoke. The other 3 panicked, their trigger fingers twitching reflexively. But the sheer kinetic force of the high-pressure mud snapped their wrists back. 3 plasma rifles clattered onto the steel deck, splashing oily mist half a meter into the air. Marcus grabbed the collar of a younger rigger who was about to get tossed by the recoil, yanking him back into place. His voice boomed over the roar of the water cannons. "Spray their damn helmet sensors. Daunt, you skimp on the mud. Pump wear and tear is on old Phil's tab today." The pitch-black mud geysers relentlessly tracked the 4 stumbling figures. The high-pressure streams were so fierce, they blasted the black gunk right out of the deck seams, exposing the silver-gray metal beneath. The 4 elite aliens were entirely swallowed by an impenetrable black waterfall, from head to toe. Not a single square inch of their armor escaped the deluge. A string of blinding red error codes exploded across Karen's holographic HUD. The green dots for her 4 flankers instantly winked out under the mud coordinates. The deafening system failure alarms nearly blew out her helmet comms. The burn on the back of her neck throbbed violently. She threw herself against the observation port, just in time to see the heavy black mud fall flatten her subordinates against the deck. Their pristine thermal armor was entombed in thick barite mud. Not a single cooling vent was spared. The encrypted tactical channel was stripped of its crisp, disciplined reports, replaced entirely by the panicked howling of 4 soldiers on the edge of a breakdown. Error messages pinged endlessly, optical sensors blind, servo motors jammed by viscous sludge, respiratory filters choked with barite powder. They tumbled over each other in the ankle-deep muck. They patted down their own bodies, unable to even find the grips of their weapons. The mud-packed heavy armor sapped whatever strength they had left just to lift their arms. Karen's knuckles turned bone-white around her own modified rifle. Her interstellar assault force had conquered hundreds of advanced star systems, and she had never, ever encountered an attack that could completely brick a full set of tactical armor in 3 flat seconds. Her genetically ingrained tactical priorities scrambled into total chaos. No energy shield collision warnings, no ballistic trajectory calculations. The database couldn't even find a match for what the hell these enemy weapons were. She checked her remaining HUD. Her last 3 mobile elites were pushing toward the control room in combat formation. Their temperature gauges were already glowing bright yellow. The methane alarms across the rig were still flashing red. ready to trigger a second chain reaction explosion if they so much as sneezed wrong. She opened her mouth to scream into the comms, ordering the three to abort and evade the unknown strike. But out of the corner of her eye, she caught a glimpse of the control room feed. That grease-stained old human was already making his move. Old Phil's thumb slammed heavily onto the three jittery yellow dots on his thermal monitor. The three active elites were creeping over the slick oil mud, inching toward the control room's blast doors. On the background data panel, their armor temperature bars were rocketing into the red. Even through the soundproof walls, you could faintly hear the shrill whine of their warning systems. With his other hand, Phil snatched the blast-proof walkie-talkie off the side of the console. His barite-stained fingers left a greasy black smear on the mic housing. His voice was as rough as sandpaper. Mad Dog, west-northwest, 17 degrees. Deck 3 pipe rack. Coordinates locked. Put those tin cans right in your crosshairs. Over the radio, Mad Dog mumbled a garbled acknowledgement from the crane cab, his voice thick with the smell of cheap cigars. Without missing a beat, Phil's finger hammered the central winch red release button. The hydraulic lock securing the multi-ton casing hissed violently as it depressurized. The solid steel pipe, hanging from the main crane cable, slipped its secondary safety latch. Dangling mid-air, the massive steel behemoth caught the rig's hot updraft, gently swaying into a lethal arc. Beside Phil, two young roughnecks watching the gas monitors instinctively took 3 huge steps back, white-knuckling the steel guardrail and holding their breath. 20 meters up in the crane operator's cab, the half-inch of ash on Mad Dog's cigar broke apart in the 105-degree heat, snowing down onto his grease-caked cargo pants. His calloused knuckles squeezed the rubber grip of the joystick so hard, they left deep white indents. Leaning so far forward his chest almost pressed against the cab's tempered glass, he ruthlessly slammed the joystick all the way down. The cable winch let out an ear-piercing, metal-tearing shriek. The multi-ton solid steel casing dropped its limit lock, instantly turning its heat wind sway into a brutally heavy gravity pendulum. It swept across the deck target zone with a terrifying swoosh that sounded like it could peel the paint off a battleship. Black mud splattered off its coarse surface as it swung, violently plowing into a discarded drill pipe joint, half buried in the mud. The debris launched 50 feet away, slamming into an oil storage tank and leaving a massive dent. An empty beer can rolled around Mad Dog's boots. He whistled a tuneless note around his cigar, his eyes dead-locked on the 3 bright red heat signatures creeping toward the control room doors. The swinging steel casing moved so fast it dragged a blurry afterimage, its immense kinetic energy pushing ripples into the surrounding methane gas. The blunt end of the pipe was less than a foot away from the glowing hot back of the lead assault trooper. Karen snapped her head up. All she saw was a massive carbon steel cylinder dragging a dark gray blur, carrying enough horrifying kinetic force to ripple the air, smashing laterally toward her vanguard. Pure biological instinct sent her diving backward, screaming evasion orders into the comms. But it was too late. The 2-point men couldn't even finish their turn. Their personal energy shields, cranked to max power, didn't last half a second, shattering into blue sparks like frozen glass. The multi-ton solid pipe slammed dead center into their overheating silver armor. A dense, sickening crunch of snapping alloy skeletons followed immediately. The 2 soldiers were launched off the deck, taking out the 3rd guy behind them who couldn't break in time. All 3 elite assault units didn't even have time to scream before they tore straight through the rigs, rusted guardrails, and plummeted 50 feet down into the black oil swamp below. The splash of filthy sludge even hit Karen's faceplate. Karen crashed hard into the slick muck. On her wrist display, entire clusters of red dots representing her squad vanished completely. The comm channel was dead, filled with nothing but the hiss of static. Not a single tactical telemetry ping returned. She scrambled backward across the deck, her spine slamming into the cracked casing of the blowout preventer, which was currently hissing natural gas into the air. There wasn't a single friendly heat signature left on her HUD. Before she could even process the devastating wipeout, the peripheral thermal vision on her helmet picked up a silhouette. A human male built like a damn grizzly bear and coated in black grease was slowly standing up from the mud puddle in front of her. The 100-pound industrial pipe wrench in his hands caught the cold, blunt gleam of the platform's residual fires. Marcus straightened up from the ankle-deep muck. His knuckles were bone white around the grip of the massive wrench, his oil-slicked biceps bulging like cast iron. The 105-degree heat wave pumped leaking methane straight into his lungs. His singed hair still smelled of burnt flesh, but he didn't even bother to cough. He just marched toward the bop, his steel-toed boots dropping like lead weights. A few elites lay scattered at his feet, permanently blinded by the mud. One was still pathetically pawing at the muck, trying to find his weapon. Marcus didn't miss a beat. He kicked the guy's plasma rifle 10 feet away. It clattered heavily against the thick wall of the blowout preventer with a dull, metallic thud. Every step he took sent heavy shock waves through the puddles, pushing the packed black sludge out of the floor seams. A few strides later, he had a clear view of Karen, backed up against the ruptured preventer. Her silver thermal armor was splattered with crude, the scorch marks on the back of her neck still smoking faintly. She was backed into a corner, her spine pinned against the crack hissing with high-pressure natural gas. There was nowhere left to run. Marcus cracked a wide grin, flashing oil-stained teeth. He hoisted the 100-pound wrench onto his shoulder, the blunt metal scraping against his calloused collarbone. He could literally hear the frantic, escalating whine of her tactical armor's warning systems. He was less than 15 feet away now, close enough to see the sheer disbelief in her eyes through the half-smeared faceplate. In the next second, Karen sharply raised her arm, leveling the muzzle of her modified high-yield plasma rifle right at his face. Karen squeezed the trigger to its absolute limit. The rifle's energy charge loop maxed out into angry crimson on her HUD. She could already picture the blast of superheated plasma vaporizing this filthy barbarian, helmet, shoulder, and all. The trigger clicked dead bottom. Instead of the air-ripping hum of plasma, a spurt of black oil mixed with barite grit hissed out of the weapon's nano-cooling vents, spraying the lower half of her visor. Her helmet alarms immediately shrieked at max volume. It hit her too late. Nobody had told her to clear the heat sinks after taking a mud bath. The crude oil and sludge had totally plugged the vents, trapping all the thermal energy inside the firing chamber. Catastrophic misfire. A blinding white flame detonated from the middle of the rifle. The modified high-yield energy core instantly went into critical overload. Terrifying heat surged up her right arm. The silver thermal armor on her arm curled and melted like aluminum foil tossed into a blast furnace, driving a searing, bone-deep agony straight into her brain. She could actually hear her own servo motors melting down in the inferno. The recoil violently slammed her against the hissing gas lines of the blowout preventer, gouging deep scores into her back armor, while the smoking stump of the rifle dropped into the oil-slicked deck. Karen's vision went dark from the blinding pain. Through her oil-streaked visor, she saw the hulking roughneck close the gap to within 2 steps. His scarred, heavily muscled arms hoisted the jagged, thick jaw of the pipe wrench high above his head. Its heavy metal shadow completely eclipsed her face. The weld-scarred, massive steel jaws smashed dead center into Karen's transparent faceplate. The high-strength nano-alloy visor instantly spider-webbed with fine cracks. A split second later, it blew apart, showering the nearby bop pipes with shrapnel. The massive kinetic force flattened Karen straight onto her back in the slick crude. The tactical comms module on the side of her helmet popped, showering tiny blue sparks. His hands numb from the impact, Marcus kept his grip on the vibrating wrench handle. He spat a mouthful of dirt and spit into the sludge by his boots, ground his heel into the slippery barite mud, and stepped forward, driving a heavy knee straight into Karen's chest to pin her down. The veins bulging on his exposed forearms hadn't even started to settle. Karen lay paralyzed in the thick black muck. Her melted right arm hung uselessly at her side. Her only good hand twitched involuntarily toward her waist, her fingertips weakly pressing down on the raised red emergency beacon. The calibration module inside her gauntlet let out a familiar low-frequency hum. Pale blue activation light bled through the cracks in her ruined armor, casting a glow on her grease-stained fingers. Lying flat in the viscous crude, the jagged edges of her shattered visor digging painfully into her cheeks, she stared up at the earthling roughneck. He was glaring down at her, gripping that 100-pound wrench, his arms thick with muscle and caked in enough oil to fuel a fire. 3 years memorizing tactical manuals at the Interstellar Assault Command Academy. Thousands of simulations wiping out lesser civilizations. All of it pulverized into dust. Optical cloaking, plasma suppression, thermal predictions. It was all a massive joke on a rig rigged with leaky methane, high-pressure mudlines, and multi-ton steel pipes swinging from the rafters. Her squad of 12 absolute elite shock troopers hadn't laid a single finger on the enemy before getting wiped by a pack of crude miners who couldn't even synthesize an energy shield. Centuries of high-dimensional superiority complex turned to ash the moment Marcus' wrench shattered her nano-visor. Suddenly, an ear-splitting roar detonated 20 meters behind her. The assault pod, its cloaking system long dead, shuddered violently. The rear thrusters spewed blinding pale blue ion flames, instantly igniting the deck's surface oil into a half-meter wall of blue fire. 4 hydraulic landing legs snapped open with heavy clacks, their razor-sharp alloy claws biting deep into the non-slip steel deck. The entire pod began to lift off, engine gauges redlining, shaking the deck plates so hard they rattled your teeth. Karen gasped for air under the crushing weight of Marcus' knee. Through the grime-covered glass of the control room, she watched the supervisor, old Phil, turn away from his monitors. His calloused finger slowly pressed down on the red kill switch for the hydraulic casing tongs. The heavy industrial hydraulic tongs, sitting idle for 3 years and designed to shear scrapped steel pipes, roared to life. The high-pressure hydraulic lines let out a thunderous groan. Tens of thousands of tons of crushing force channeled straight into the hardened steel jaws. The 2-meter-wide steel claws slammed down from the derrick side, biting brutally into the alien pod's rear thruster base with a sickening crunch. The pale blue ion flame was instantly pinched into a twisted tongue of fire sweeping the deck. The spreading crude crackled and popped in the heat. The fleeing drop pod thrashed wildly like a beetle pinched in an iron fist. The silver-gray alloy hull was gouged with deep gashes, the thruster nozzles physically crushed into mangled scrap metal. Even with engines pushed to critical overload, the pod didn't budge an inch. Instead, the searing ion flames backflowed through the pipes straight into the hull. On the control room monitors, the external temperature readouts skyrocketed, breaching 1,200 degrees in seconds. Old Phil's menthol cigarette had burned down to the filter. As ash dropped onto his gas detector screen, he didn't even bat an eye. Glancing at the flashing thermal warnings, he grabbed the PA mic, cranked it to max, and barked at the deck, "Marcus, the tail on that ship behind you is gonna blow in 3 seconds. Drag the live one out of there." Out on the deck, Marcus' ears rang from the deafening PA. The heat rolling off the leaking pod plastered his singed hair flat against his head. He shot a glance at the pod's tail. The metal jaws were already glowing white-hot, dripping sizzling slag. Planting his thick arm in the greasy muck, he reached out with his other massive hand and grabbed Karen right by her shattered armor collar. The barite mud caked in his fingers hissed as it touched her boiling hot plating. With a violent heave, he dragged her backward. Karen's battered body couldn't resist the brutal force. She was dragged like a dying animal by the scruff of its neck, carving a long, silver-flecked black trench through the vibrating deck. His singed hair crisped up even more from the scorching updraft. The old injury on his thumb web flared up with pain from the strain, but he kept his other arm securely locked around that 100-pound wrench. In 3 massive strides, he hauled her clean out of the primary blast zone, slamming her down hard next to the hissing gas leak of the blowout preventer. The white-hot jaws of the tongs were raining bright red slag onto the steel deck, burning tiny smoking craters. The ship's hull was already popping and cracking, threatening to split. Marcus leaned down, his breath a potent mix of sweat, crude oil and diesel, hitting Karen right in her exposed face. His roar easily drowned out the screaming engines. Listen real close, alien scum. I ain't got the time or the patience for interstellar diplomacy. You ping your buddies up in the sky right damn now, and you tell them to stay the hell away from this oil field. You cost me my drill bonus this week. I'll shove you straight into the mud pump for counterweight and blast you 2,000 meters underground. He lifted the wrench, pressing its freezing jaws directly against the white-hot scorch mark on her neck, while his calloused hand slammed down on her wrists, flashing red emergency beacon. Surrounding them, the rig hands leveled their mud-filled fire hoses, the heavy nozzles aimed dead at Karen's face. If she twitched wrong, they were gonna pump her lungs full of barite fluid. Absolute, crushing despair filled Karen's only good eye. She could feel the heavy breathing of the human beside her. She heard the comms module under her gauntlet spooling up. The bone-deep terror crawled up her paralyzed spine. With a trembling, surviving left hand, she pressed the transmission confirm button. The moment her finger brushed the freezing confirm key, the wrench jammed into her scorched neck sent a spike of blinding pain through her, making her flinch and press down hard. With a sharp crackle, the static-filled tactical channel snapped open. A holographic projection of the interstellar mothership's command deck popped up. The fleet commander on the other side still wore his arrogant high and mighty sneer, opening his mouth to demand why the entire squad had dropped off the grid. But the second his eyes locked onto the live feed Karen was broadcasting, his silver-blue scaled face completely froze. Karen could feel her back coated in iron shavings and mud. The dull throb from her ruined right arm was tearing her consciousness apart. Beside her, the cracking of the pod's hull grew louder, chunks of glowing red slag dropping into the muck and kicking up pungent, sulfuric white smoke. She didn't dare hide a single detail. With her shaking left hand, she keyed in every environmental parameter of this death zone, the disabled status of all her troops, and the terrifying reality that firing plasma caused immediate self-immolation while mud instantly bricked high-tier tactical armor. Finally, her finger hovered over the area marker, and with every ounce of strength she had left, she slammed the red absolute quarantine zone option. In the notes, she typed, coordinates ruled by berserk, heavy industry species utilizing indiscriminate attacks. All conventional tactics nullified. Approach by any vessel strictly prohibited. Execute immediate fleet-wide retreat and lockdown. Dead silence hung over the channel for 3 agonizing seconds. Then the steady green signal light on Karen's wrist wildly flashed a blinding crimson. High-frequency electromagnetic jamming instantly flooded the comm link. The old injury in Marcus' hand flared up again as he held her down against the pipe. The high-frequency static from her gauntlet rattled his eardrums. Frowning, he shoved his greasy earmuffs back over his head and watched the crimson light blinking frantically on her wrist. A second later, the red light flared bright, then died completely. The gauntlet hissed, spitting out a wisp of acrid blue smoke, totally bricked. The faintest glimmer of hope for rescue on Karen's ruined face died instantly. She realized the mothership orbiting in near space hadn't issued a single follow-up order. They didn't even bother running the remote data wipe on her tactical module. They just completely severed the connection, kicked the engines into overdrive, and jumped the hell out of the sector, abandoning every trooper in the Permian Basin to rot. The drop pod, pinned down by the heavy hydraulic tongs, let out a final, metal-shredding shriek. The remaining thruster fuel violently detonated inside the sealed hull, Blue-white plasma fire vomited out of the gashes torn by the tongs, shaking the entire wreck like a leaf on the steel deck. Marcus took 3 massive steps back, wrench in hand, using his other to yank Karen by her broken collar completely out of the blast radius, leaving 2 deep black heel marks in the oily mud. After a muffled boom, the chaos died down. The pod's propulsion system was a pile of slag. Its once proud silver hull was charred, curled, and completely dead. The riggers gathered around whistled and hollered, one of them kicking a motionless alien buried in the mud just to confirm the thermal armor was cold. The 105-degree heat wave blew the harsh stench of crude right into Marcus' face. His singed hair finally crisped off, falling down his collar. He looked up toward the control room 50 feet away. Behind the bulletproof glass, old Phil pressed his greasy finger down on the PA's rubber button. The industrial speaker's buzz popped heavily, drowning out the crackling embers of the drop pod. Phil ran his fingers over a row of flashing alarm lights, tapping the reset buttons one by one to silence the high-pitched ringing. Once the gas detectors settled safely in the green, he leaned into the mic. His voice was as steady as the casing pipes drilled thousands of feet into the earth. "All right, listen up. Rig clear. All crews reset your gear and get back to standard operations. Whatever footage we lost today, you boys make it up before shift's end." He paused for a half-second, eyeing the silver armor scraps lying in the muck on his monitors, and added, "West sector, grab some weave bags and fish those tin cans out of the mud. Don't let 'em soak in the crude too long or they'll be a bitch to weigh. Drag 'em to Tool Shed 3 and lock 'em up. Well, cash 'em in for scrap bonus after shift." The PA clicked off. Phil grabbed a stainless steel tumbler of Coke that had been sitting for half an hour, sweating oily condensation, and took a massive gulp. The ice clinked against the metal. He glanced up at the monitor to see Marcus hefting his massive wrench onto his shoulder, strolling right past a paralyzed Karen. The hissing bop line glowed with a faint red thermal signature on the screen, and Marcus was walking straight toward the still smoking slag heap of the alien pod. Marcus' boots squelched in the black sludge, his massive wrench swaying on his shoulder. He didn't even bat an eye as he passed by Karen, who was slumped like a sack of mud. The pod slag was still radiating a blistering orange-red heat, curling the remaining hairs on his temples. He slammed his wrench into the deck, rattling the bolts around his boots. Fighting the sting in his hand, he jammed the wrench's jaw into the seam of a titanium hatch. With a brutal heave, he physically pried off the very same hatch the Starfleet claimed could withstand asteroid impacts. The scalding metal seared his work gloves, throwing off the smell of burnt rubber. Swearing, Marcus shook his hand, flinging hot slag 10 feet away. Dragging the hunk of metal, which was harder than blast steel, back to the hissing bop line, he slapped it perfectly over the glowing crack. Grabbing an arc welder, he flipped his mask down. Blinding blue-white sparks instantly erupted, lighting up the floating methane waves around him. Over the sizzle of the welder, he screamed into his radio, spit flying against his visor. "Phil, you son of a bitch! This alien circus just cost us 20 minutes of production. You try and tell me this ain't counting towards overtime. I swear to God, I'll dump every cold Coke in your locker straight into the mud pit. I promised my kid a PS5 last week, and I need this check to clear it. Don't give me that interstellar invasion is an act of God bullshit. I don't care if the Lord Almighty comes down here. I'm getting triple time for this." Phil's laughter echoed back over the radio, cigar still clamped in his teeth, backed by the sounds of riggers yelling and throwing hooks into the oil swamp. His voice crackled through. "Keep your hands steady and don't burn a hole in that pipe, kid. I'll double your attendance bonus this month. All that alien titanium you just pried off goes straight to the scrapyard. You keep the cash. That's enough for 2 PS5s and a new necklace for your wife." The last spark of the arc welder died. Marcus flipped his mask off, tossing it aside. He looked up just in time to see Mad Dog waving a cigar from the crane cab, the multi-ton casing perfectly settling onto the scrap pile. Lying next to the pipe, Karen watched helplessly as these grease-caked roughnecks hauled off her elite trooper's armor for pocket change, welding their indestructible drop pod hatch over a leaky oil pipe. The very last shred of her civilization's superiority complex was ground into dust. Her vision went black, and she passed out cold in the warm mud. The 105-degree heat wave rolled across the rig, carrying the sharp stink of crude. Off in the distance, a pump jack continued its slow, methodical nod. In the evening winds of the Permian Basin, aside from the lingering metallic tang of a welder, you'd never know this place had just effortlessly crushed an interstellar invasion worthy of the history books. NASA suits showed up later, sniffing around to buy the alien wreckage at top dollar. Old Phil met them at the gate with the rig's work log, demanding they cover the platform's downtime costs first. They ended up driving off empty-handed. To this crew of roughnecks, an alien invasion was just a minor hitch in their shift. A galactic empire's assault force couldn't hold a candle to the raw, undeniable reality of a fat overtime paycheck at the end of the month.
Typing the final period of this story, I let out a long breath, almost feeling as though I had just inhaled a lungful of crude oil and sweat alongside Marcus and Old Phil under that blistering 105-degree Texas sun. The core inspiration behind this piece was to completely flip the classic sci-fi trope of the unstoppable advanced alien invasion on its head. We are so used to seeing interstellar armadas decimating human militaries with force fields and laser beams. But I couldn't help but wonder, what happens when a squad of elite, hyper-advanced extraterrestrials, accustomed to clean, precise, and highly digitized warfare, crashes headfirst into the grittiest, dirtiest, and most unyielding heavy industry site on Earth? The result is brutally simple. In the face of absolute physical mass, 5,000 psi of barite drilling mud, and multi-ton solid steel casing pipes, all that highly touted optical cloaking and thermal armor becomes an absolute joke. I absolutely loved writing this contrast. On one side, alien warlords yielding plasma rifles and reciting subjugation laws. On the other, grease-caked roughnecks wielding 100-pound pipe wrenches, spitting Texas curses, and only caring about whether their overtime checks will clear this Friday. In many ways, this is a dark comedy love letter to blue-collar grit. To these rugged rig workers, a galactic empire isn't an existential threat. It's just a highly annoying workplace safety violation. It's a bunch of glowing tin cans dropping out of the sky to delay their shift, and ultimately, an unexpected scrap metal bonus. I hope this rust-covered, diesel-soaked HFY humanity, fuck yeah, story brings a visceral, violently satisfying joy. In an era obsessed with pristine AI and virtual data, it's fun to remember that sometimes humanity's greatest strength isn't our advanced code, it's our sheer, stubborn, heavy-hitting resilience.